Our scripture text for today comes from Mark, and we're reading there in the 6th chapter and beginning at verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had taught and done. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place, all by yourselves, and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them and where they were going, and hurried on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages to buy something for themselves to eat." But Jesus answered them, "You give them something to eat." And he said to them, or they said to him rather, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven. He blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples and set them before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them. And all ate and were filled. They took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. May God add a blessing to the reading of the sacred word. I was in the hardware store the other day. In line, I had purchased a filter for a appliance we have at home. And as I was standing there in line, a gentleman came up behind me who had an armful of these same filters. And he looked at me standing there with my one filter and said, "Haven't you heard? They're going to stop making those. They're going to run out. You should go back and get as many as you can carry so that you're sure that you have enough." He was very concerned that there was going to be a shortage. Mind you, that you only replace this filter about every 18 months or so. But here he was with his armful, very concerned about the coming scarcity of this particular device. And so it goes for us, does it not? I flip through the television channels, and there's always someone on television telling me that they only have a few thousand left, and I'd better order mine by midnight tonight, or I'm not going to get mine. And in fact, I shouldn't take any risks, because if I order by midnight tonight and only pay shipping and handling, I can have 2 of whatever it is that I really don't need. But they're convincing me I have to have, and I must make that decision quickly. We live in a culture that is constantly reminding us of scarcity, that there's not going to be enough, and creating anxiety around that issue. I think of the guy in the hardware store who was perpetuating and participating in the myth that there weren't going to be any of these by buying them all. He was right. There was going to be a shortage for others. He didn't realize his own role in that. And if you have access to the internet, obviously you do if you're watching this, and Google search global scarcity or global shortage, you will be amazed at all of the things that come up. There's a global shortage of helium, which is going to make having happy birthday parties with helium balloons a problem at some point, or at least very costly. CBS predicted a couple of months ago there will soon, no doubt, be a bacon shortage. Now, that's a crisis. How will we survive? Fox News has suggested that we are going to experience a global wine crisis. Reuters disputes that, but you really want to take a chance? I mean, the Huffington Post says we need to prepare for a shortage of honey for chocolate. and God forbid, coffee. Now, understand that means the apocalypse is surely upon my house, because I drink coffee for your protection, and my wife will verify that very fact. Global shortages. We live with this anxiety. There won't be enough. A global nursing shortage, a global engineering shortage, a medical isotope shortage, a global shortage of skilled trades. And to get a little more serious about it, according to the United Nations, 1.2 billion people, that's 20% of the world's population, live in areas of physical water scarcity. And another 1.6 billion, or 25% of the global population, live in what's known as economic water scarcity. That means the inability to have infrastructure to take waters from existing rivers and aquifers. Egypt has been threatening for a couple of years now to blow up a dam in Ethiopia because, as we all know from the First Testament, Egypt is not Egypt without the Nile. Pollution, agricultural demands, climate change are all stressing water supplies from the desert southwest of the U.S. all the way to India. And it's creating anxiety. According to the dictionary, a shortage is a deficiency of that which is needed. And I contrast that when I read the scriptures to the idea of wherever Jesus is, there always seems to be enough. I don't know if you've ever noticed that or not, but wherever Jesus is, there always seems to be enough. Even when it would appear that there's not sufficiency, somehow in the presence of Jesus, representing the presence of God in the world, there is always abundance. Whether it is the story of from John's Gospel of wine running out at a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and suddenly there's 180 gallons of the really good stuff, or whether it's this story we have this morning, a story that is the only miracle recorded in all four Gospels, the only miracle of Jesus that all four writers felt was so important they had to include it in their particular telling of the life and ministry of Jesus, for their particular word to the church. They all come to this unique story, one that's pretty familiar to us all, perhaps because it is told four different ways. As it appears to us in Mark's Gospel, it's kind of interesting to think about its placement. That probably sheds some light for us on what's happening. In the story that immediately precedes this one, there has been a great banquet, a great feast of opulence, probably a very decadent feast. It was in Herod's kingdom. And during that feast, a young woman, when asked to dance, asks for the head of John the Baptist in return. And that feast, that meal, and the occurrence of death and destruction and vengeance, and the anxiety that was produced by John's presence, the prophet, in the realm, is contrasted to this particular feast that takes place in the wilderness in the presence of Jesus. It sets the tone for us as to why Jesus perhaps wanted to get away with the disciples. It wasn't just the coming and going that they were so busy they didn't even have time to eat, which is an interesting preface to the story. But this whole idea that in the midst of this grief that they are experiencing, they want to go away into the wilderness, into a deserted place, to kind of regroup and regather. Wilderness provides a number of clues for us as we think about the way it's used in the Testament. I have a number of friends who are kind of geeky around digital television and DVDs. There's these little things called Easter eggs that they can go and find in the menus that take them to other material that's on the DVD that you wouldn't know is there. There's a clue, and you have to kind of find it and follow it. For the rest of us, we miss it. And we might miss some of the clues that are here on the menu of what wilderness means. Of course, in the First Testament, it meant a place of danger, a place of scarcity, a place where demons dwelled, a place often of testing, and a place where some went because in that sort of depravity of not having anything but scrub brush and sand, one could get away from the distractions of life and kind of refocus. It was a place of testing. We remember Jesus being driven into the wilderness according to the gospel stories. And the Bible also lifts up wilderness, though, as a place of provision. Think about the children of Israel, and we hear this begin to fall on our ear if we're listening carefully to the text of God providing manna for the children of Israel when they were wandering in the desert, complaining that they didn't have enough, aware of what they did not have, and God provided manna. And this manna, you'll remember two things about it very carefully, I think. One was that it didn't matter how much you gathered, you had enough. And the other thing about manna, where it appears in Exodus 16, is that if you took too much, not believing that there would be some for tomorrow, it spoiled, except on the day before the Sabbath. So there are those kinds of images floating around in this story for us. And the wilderness, too, was seen in some cases as a place of renewal and restoration, where God would shape and reshape the wilderness, remake the wilderness in God's return, and as the realm would fully break into the world, that the desert itself would bloom and be a place for the acacia tree and the olive to exist. And so it was also a place where God could be revealed. So those clues are kind of in the text for us. As they go to this place, they intend to be alone, but the people, so needy for what it is that Jesus and the disciples have to offer, see where they are headed, and it must have been a bad day on the water. It takes a long time to row. Folks were able to get ahead of them, and here when they land on the shore, thinking they're going to have a few days alone, they find themselves in the midst of a great crowd with great needs. Now, one can imagine the disappointment they might have experienced in that moment. But Jesus looks at the crowd, and it says very distinctly, he had compassion on them. They were like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus is moved, even in his own need to be away and to have some quiet time and a time to kind of regroup and regather, sets that aside in order to meet the needs of the people. And so he teaches all day long. And then it gets to be late. And the disciples, I think well-meaning here. I don't think trying to be rude to the people who've gathered. Say, Jesus, you need to send the folks away. It's been a long day. They need to go find something to eat. We certainly didn't pack enough for this trip. Let them go out and buy food and be on their way. And then Jesus says the most remarkable thing. He looks at them and he says, you give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. I'm really struck by that because I know in the Gospel of Mark, and I imagine you know this too, that anytime Jesus is talking to the disciples, he's talking to the church. That's who he's talking to. And Mark is always pretty honest with us about how obtuse the disciples are sometimes, that they just don't get it. And they look around and they say, we don't have the resources to do this. We can't possibly do this. Their immediate reaction is, this is beyond us. And Jesus says, go and look and see what you've got. And they come back and they report the sort of dismal news, a few loaves, a few fish, that's it. And Jesus says, well, bring them to me. And this remarkable thing happens. Jesus uses this wonderful language that's so familiar to us, right? Jesus takes, he blesses, he breaks, and he gives. It sounds just like Eucharist. It sounds just like being at the table of the Lord. Some have suspected that perhaps Jesus' language here is reminiscent of this because this was used every time the church gathered early on. Why it's in all four Gospels, the story was retold. As in the breaking of the bread, they remembered that Jesus was there to sustain them and was present to provide for them what they needed. But Jesus takes this language is given. It's one of those clues again in the text, like the word wilderness. And they pass it among the people. And suddenly there's enough. It's remarkable. I don't really know what happened. Nobody really does. I think some of us sometimes think of an experience like one I had once at seminary when it was convocation day and we had a big name speaker and the place was filled with a couple of hundred people and it was time for communion. And they had one single loaf of bread. And as the bread was torn and being given out, folks in the back began to realize there wasn't going to be enough. People were tearing off big chunks of it and dipping it into the cup, and the folks in the back figured that, well, maybe we'll be lucky and at least get a blessing because there's not going to be enough for communion here. But suddenly, amidst the murmuring, and you could sort of hear it happen, suddenly there was enough. Now, whether people just started taking smaller pieces, realizing that there were other people to be served, that I think some folks think that's what happened in this particular occasion. As the bread was passed and the fish came around, folks also had a little something stashed in their robe, like folks tend to do, had a little something extra, and they used that, and so they could pass something else on. Maybe they even had a little more than they realized they could share with someone else, and the sharing itself was the miracle. That's possible. Some who are more skeptical think that maybe Jesus was perched in front of a cave and this had all been staged and the disciples had stockpiled bread and were passing it through and no one could see it. So that folks would be amazed, Mark is pretty sure that this is a real miracle. Mark wants us to see this as what it means when the realm of God is close, that there is enough for everyone. And that the way in which that takes place is through the disciples. Jesus just doesn't look at them and say, well, I'll fix this. Jesus asks them for what they have. Jesus takes the resources, however meager they are, asks for those resources, and then in Jesus' blessing and sharing those, somehow they become enough so that 12 baskets full are left over. It is really a miracle. It is a remarkable occurrence meant to point to what it means when the church is being authentically church, when the disciples are being authentically obedient and offering what they have and giving it so that suddenly there is enough. It is a remarkable story, and it sits with us asking the question as we look around at the great needs in the world and the real scarcities that exist because we have mismanaged the abundance that God has provided for us. We live in a world where the rich seem to get richer, the poor poorer, and we can't even agree on what would be a living wage for people. In all of that difficulty, folks are suffering. And it seems so overwhelming to us, we're just sort of paralyzed and we don't know where to begin. But this text encourages us to think about what it is that we have. What are the resources we have to offer? However meager they might seem, given to the church, given to the realm of God, put to the purpose of Jesus, suddenly they can become enough. So even a few canned goods you might have around the house that you could leave off at the food bank, a check you could write to disciples in that church might be a very small amount, but would provide for the spiritual feeding of God's people through this particular ministry. The gift of time you might have, just maybe a few hours to give to visit a person, to express the compassion of Jesus Christ by your presence. A handwritten note to someone. I know I get a lot of mail, but most of it just gets carried from the house to the kitchen counter. But a handwritten note gets opened and read on my way into the house. I can't wait. Someone's taken the time to make that effort. It seems like such a small thing, but it becomes so much more. And so it is for us in the church. So it is for us as the people of God to see this as a model, as an example, as a command for us to believe that there is enough for us to share, to believe that God will provide for us in our time of need. That's what Paul says to the church at Corinth when he's encouraging them to support the saints in Jerusalem. Give, believing that God will provide for you should you have a need. And then that lowers our anxiety. The belief that God really can provide, that from the very fundamental stories from creation itself as revealed to us in Scripture, that God has made the world so that there is enough. That there is enough for everything to have not just what it needs to hang in there or survive, but for it to thrive, for it to be fruitful, to multiply. This is what God has promised us, and this is the proclamation of this text, that in the realm of God, in the ways in which the realm breaks through, even through our own meager actions, suddenly there is enough of whatever is needed, and we can give thanks to God. We don't need to hoard. We don't need to gather in and hold for ourselves all that our arms will carry, but rather we can open our hand and share, and there will be enough. May it be so. Amen. In the realm of God, in the ways in which the realm breaks through, even through our own meager actions, suddenly there is enough of whatever is needed, and we can give thanks to God. We can open our hand and share, and there will be enough. May it be so. Amen.